coming in through the front door, so I'm going to stall as those folks sign in. My name is Tim Zerwinski. I'm the Director of Planning and Community Development. We are here tonight for what is, I think, going to be the final public forum on the MBTA community's zoning requirements, which is not to say that this is not the last time that we'll be talking about this before town meeting, but it'll probably be in the context of Planning Board, Select Board, Warrant Committee, and there may be some other opportunities to get out there and talk. So I'm just going to get started. I'm introducing myself right now, so we're getting item 1 out of the way. We're going to do a recap of the MBTA community zoning requirements, probably a little bit less in depth than previous. I always try to give a little bit of a recap at the start of these meetings, but I would actually recommend if you have any sort of basic questions or need some basic background on the act and what we're doing. The planning board held a public hearing on this zoning last week. That recording should be up on the MATV website and streaming on YouTube. We're going to go over the zoning subdistricts and the dimensional parameters and the zoning language that's in the actual article that we're bringing to town meeting. Again, the planning board had a public hearing about this last week. The select board will be voting tomorrow to approve the warrant. So, you know, we all know there's always movement before town meeting, but we're settling on final language, and so we'll give a little bit of an overview of that. This next item, implications of MBTA community zoning, is just a few items that I've been picking up from comments that we've heard at public meetings and letters that we've gotten, just to kind of talk through some of what MBTA community zoning would mean for the town if it passed. And then finally, we're going to have a question and comment period. We've got our little, that's not quite a podium, but it's something. So we'll ask people to step up, and at the end, if you've got questions and comments, that'll be the time. So just as I always do at the start of these meetings, everything that we do related to MBTA communities goes on townofmilton.org/MiltonMBTA. That is linked off the Planning and Community Development website. It's also linked off the Planning Board website. So this presentation and the recording of this presentation will go up there. Ditto for all of the previous presentations and recordings that we've done. I want to take this opportunity while this slide is up to just kind of talk about a little of the outreach efforts that we've been engaging in to try to make sure that people know about this, very consequential town meeting action that's going to be happening in December. So, obviously, we're on the town website. We've been posting all of our materials. This is, we've been doing a monthly forum every month since like March. MBTA Communities has been a standing item on the planning board agenda bi-weekly for several months. We've been at the farmers market. We've posted flyers with both information about MBTA communities and information about these forums, here at the library, businesses throughout town. The planning board included an insert into your water bill. So as of, I think, whenever the water bills go out for November, all of the properties in Milton that have water coming out of the tap will have gotten a flyer that basically says, this is MBTA Communities, go to the website, come to these meetings. We've gotten at least 2/3 of all properties in the town of Milton. So, almost everyone, a month prior to town meeting is going to get sort of directly touched by this. We also sent a letter to town meeting members back in August, just basically saying, like, look, you're going to get a warrant. It's going to include, this article. You should tune into the planning board. You should tune into these forums, link to the website. So we've really been trying to make sure that, obviously all of the sort of informal kind of grassroots, engagement efforts, but also direct contact with town meeting members and direct contact with every property owner in town. So, hopefully people have gotten the message and are talking to their town meeting members. Yeah. No. It's being live streamed by MATV, yeah. So, yep. So what is the MBTA Communities Law? So MBTA communities was enacted as part of a major economic development bill in January of 2021, and it amends Mass General Laws Chapter 40A with a new Section 3A. This is the Zoning Act. So if you hear us refer to Section 3A of the Zoning Act, we're talking about MBTA communities. And it requires that an MBTA community, which is a statutorily defined term that basically, anywhere that's served by the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority, shall have at least one zoning district of reasonable size in which multifamily housing, which is defined in statute as either 3 or more units or a parcel with more than one building with more than one unit in it, is permitted as of right. And that means you meet all the requirements of the zoning, you check all the boxes, you go to the building commissioner, and he gives you your building permit, just as if you were putting a deck on the back of your house or building a single-family house on an acre lot in an A zone. As opposed to our typical process for rezoning for larger projects, multifamily projects, which is via a special permit, which has a lot more strings attached, which has a lot more discretion on the part of the planning board in terms of whether or not you actually issue those permits. So as of right is a big part of this law. We don't have multifamily as of right zoning for the most part, actually at all in the town of Milton, and so it's a major change. Other criteria that the zoning district that we're required to create must meet. It's got to allow housing at a minimum gross density of 15 units per acre. The law says not more than half a mile from a commuter rail station, subway station, ferry terminal, or bus station, if applicable. No age restrictions. A lot of the multifamily housing we have in town, Fuller Village, Winter Valley, Unquity House, is age restricted. So you're not allowed to put age restrictions. You can do age-restricted housing if a developer wants to do that, but you can't require it. And suitable for families with children. And then the statutorily defined penalties for noncompliance are, ineligibility for these 3 major grant programs that the state administers. So another thing that the law does is authorizes the state's housing agency, which is HLC, is the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities, to promulgate guidelines to help towns understand how you comply with this law. And it sort of clarifies some terms and some concepts in the law that kind of go undefined in the law. What is reasonable size? A zoning district has to be a reasonable size. What does it mean to be suitable for families with children? Other kind of aspects of the law that kind of need clarification. So one of the ways that the guidelines define reasonable size is geographically at least 50 acres, and within that geography, the potential unit capacity is the term that they use. It needs to sort of have the potential to build 2,461 units, which is 25% of our year-round housing stock. And then at least 50% of the unit capacity has to be within a half a mile of transit. Now, this is a wrinkle that kind of is, a little bit inconsistent with this first slide where it says you got to be, not more than half a mile from transit. And, where this comes from is when the guidelines were first issued, a lot of towns, Milton included, commented to the state and basically said, look, our trolley line, if you draw that circle, that half-mile circle, a lot of that geography is actually in the city of Boston. And, we don't have as much land, as much developable area to zone as other towns. Newton, Needham, Dedham, have much more developable area around their transit stations. And so what the HLC guidelines do is gives us flexibility to, utilize other areas of town up to 50% of our zoning district. So over the course of the last year plus, with the help of technical assistance providers provided with grant funding from the state and also other resources, we've tested multiple options for different geographies to form our zoning subdistrict. And we've been using a tool that the state intends to use to sort of, judge up or down whether or not towns are compliant. It's called the compliance model. And this is a software tool that basically, it's an Excel spreadsheet, has all of the formulas that kind of make up the requirements of the guidelines. We punch in a geography using parcel data from a geographic information system. We plug in dimensional parameters. We want buildings to be this tall. We want the setbacks to be this wide. And the compliance model, says, are you meeting all of these parameters? Are you at 15 units per acre? Is your geography at least 50 acres? is your unit capacity at least 2,461. It's been complicated. We've been working through this, at the planning board, with their feedback. It's easy to get compliant districts. It's hard to get compliant districts that also are consistent with our planning goals. And so that's been a lot of the work that we've been doing over the course of the last year. So the effect of noncompliance, as I mentioned earlier, the statute lays out 3 grant programs that the state administers that MBTA communities, if you are not compliant, will be ineligible for. Housing Choice Initiative is a sort of incentive program for housing production. Milton's not eligible, probably won't be eligible unless we get some serious, every 40B starts to actually get built. Not a lot of implications for the town of Milton on that one. Local Capital Projects Fund is actually a grant that we get on a consistent basis. It's generated from casino revenue. And it's appropriated every year by the legislature. So it's not a competitive grant or an application-based grant. That typically goes to subsidies for public housing authorities. So the Milton Housing Authority typically gets between $30,000 and $35,000 a year of state subsidy through the Local Capital Projects Fund. The most recent budget that the legislature passed actually kind of makes an end around of MBTA communities. It basically says you're still going to get your local capital projects fund money. There was a little bit of an outcry when this came out, and people, it's a kind of a lesser known fund, but people sort of said, we're trying to do housing here, and then you're going to take money away from public housing. What are you doing? And the legislature sort of made a correction there. And then MassWorks is sort of the major one of these 3 programs. That is a between $75 and $100 million a year grant program for infrastructure grants to promote economic development. Town of Milton has been the recipient of about $1 million in MassWorks funds, although that comes in the form of a single grant around 12 years ago. We haven't been a big player in the MassWorks game, but that is a grant program that towns that are like Milton, have gotten, multiple millions of dollars. Is this quick, sir?
Yeah, it's $1 million. Is this something that is every year, or is this
No. So MassWorks is a competitive grant, so it's an application-based grant. And so in I forget what year it was 2011, 2012, we had applied for a MassWorks grant to basically do streetscape improvements on Elliott Street between Central Ave and Milton Village. So a lot of the sort of the brickwork and the kind of rain gardens you see at the Central Ave, Elliott Street intersection came out of that. The nice sidewalks over there were from a MassWorks grant.
non-compliance in your opinion?
I've got a slide for that, if you let me continue.
Sorry, I didn't get your name, by the way.
My name's Tim Zerwinski. I'm the Director of Planning and Community Development.
In town?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
So as we've gone on in the process of working through, how to comply with the state's guidelines, a further change to the guidelines that Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities, put in was basically they administer a number of discretionary grant programs themselves, and they have said that in addition to those 3 grant programs that are identified in the statute, that they would also take MBTA communities' compliance into account for the decision-making that they make around 13 additional grant programs. And these are all listed here. A number of them don't apply to the town of Milton. We're not a rural or a small town development fund town, so that one's not quite relevant. Community planning grants, though, we've gotten several to help do MBTA communities planning. The local acquisitions for natural diversity, the land grant, administered out of the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. This is a grant that I believe we've gotten in the past. We haven't been eligible for it for a number of years because in order to be eligible for this grant, you also need to have an up-to-date open space and recreation plan, which we're in the process of doing. This is one where it's a grant fund to basically acquire open space, which we're hoping to kind of take advantage of once we have an up-to-date open space and recreation plan. And then the final one, the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Planning and Project Grants. This is the state's kind of #1 grant program for climate change resilience projects, both planning and implementation projects. So we've gotten some money from the MVP program to develop a municipal vulnerability preparedness plan. That is a grant program that we are counting on taking advantage of to help us, shore up infrastructure around some of the more vulnerable places in town that are vulnerable to sea level rise, other effects of climate change. So this is another one where, the State Housing Agency has discretion over these grants. They've said we're going to take compliance into account when we make these decisions. And then finally, there are sort of unknown but potentially predictable consequences. Both the governor and the attorney general have made statements to the effect of, this is not a question of if, it's a question of whether you do it or not. Compliance is, opting out is not an option, is the term that Governor Healy made. In addition to both the governor and the attorney general, there are also activist groups in the Commonwealth that have, sort of made the promise, we will take you to court on fair housing grounds, if you're non-compliant. Town of Holden is currently engaged in a lawsuit by the group Lawyers for Civil Rights. But this is this is an excerpt from the advisory opinion that the attorney general made back in, I feel like this might have been March or June, earlier this year. But basically asserting that, the law says that you shall have a zoning district, and that means that you shall have a zoning district. And if you don't, you're not in compliance, and you're liable to civil enforcement action under state fair housing law. So the deadline for compliance for any MBTA community has not yet come to pass yet. Milton is considered to be a rapid transit community, which is sort of the highest kind of tranche of MBTA communities. Those communities have a deadline of December 31st to pass compliant zoning. So, we'll see what happens January 1 if there are any non-compliant communities. What exactly the form of sort of civil enforcement action that the Attorney General takes, if that comes to pass. So what does compliance look like for the town of Milton? As I said, we've been working through a number of different options for geographies, a number of different options for dimensional parameters within those zoning geographies. And we've proposed 6 sub-districts. Some of them have sub-districts, mainly in the northern part of town. You'll see on the map in the next couple slides, that we believe are compliant sub-districts. And we've also drafted zoning language that lays out the dimensional parameters, application requirements, development standards, and site plan review procedures. A lot of focus on the maps, a lot of focus on the dimensional parameters. There's a whole other side to this that includes all of the different things that the planning board has within its power to kind of shape these projects and make sure that, that they work for the town of Milton. Every project that goes through MBTA community zoning will be subject to site plan review. If you remember the 440 Granite Ave project in East Milton, if you remember the Goddard School at the old Husa Club site, if you remember Novara, in East Milton Square, these were all projects that were subject to site plan review, which means it's a sort of a larger project. It's a little bit out of the ordinary compared to the normal single-family, house that we see constructed in Milton. And the planning board has the ability to review that project and propose conditions that kind of manage, design, traffic circulation, light impacts, landscaping, things like that. So every one of these projects under the zoning will be subject to site plan review at the planning board. So these are what our sub-districts look like in the context of the whole town. We've got a little bit of a zoomed-in view. I'll go from left to right, and they're keyed in by color on this boundary map. The pink district, kind of up and down Blue Hills Parkway, is what we're calling the Blue Hills Parkway Corridor District. The purple one encompasses more or less Unquity House and a handful of single-family sites around it. That's our Mattapan Station sub-district. The blue one in the middle, the biggest one, is the Elliott Street Corridor sub-district. There's a sort of a green and yellow and then hatched district That's our Milton Central Ave Station sub-district. This one is divided into a number of different parts for reasons that I'll get to in a couple slides. But basically meant to ensure that we have a continuation of mixed-use development in that district. The Orange District, again, kind of split into two parts, is our Granite Ave sub-district, Granite Ave North and Granite Ave South. And we're also doing a zoning district in East Milton Square that more or less follows the lines of the business district. The reason that these are shaped the way they're shaped is that in order to hit all of the compliance thresholds that we need to in terms of the size of the district, the physical size of it, the amount of units that could potentially be built in it, and also some of the other requirements, including your sub-districts, have to be at least 5 acres, for instance. Half of your zoning district has to be in one single contiguous geography. This sort of explains, half of our sub-district has to be, half of our zoning district has to be within the transit area, and then also half of it has to be contiguous. We're achieving that with this kind of, bunch of sub-districts up here. And I'm using my mouse, which you can't see. But sort of, you've got that Elliott Street corridor connecting the sets of sub-districts on either end.
I'm sorry, do you mind pointing out specifically, because I don't get the map entirely.
Okay. I'm going to have some more zoomed in slides in a minute. And then if we need to go back to the whole map, we can certainly do that. So, like I said, six sub-districts. And, in addition to kind of shaping them, both kind of externally as geographies and then kind of internally with the dimensional parameters that kind of will define development, we've tried to tailor them as much as possible to match the existing built environment, via those dimensional parameters, restrictions on height, density, setbacks, open space requirements. So we'll get a little bit of a closer view of each sub-district. And like I said, if we want to go back to the main map, we can do that. So, East Milton Square, as I said, generally tracing the borders of the business district. This is Granite Ave North. Granite Ave North is solely the 2 Granite Ave site, the Flatley office building by the expressway interchange. Granite Ave South comprises the state DPW yard and park and ride lot, and then also the American Legion Hall. Milton Station East is kind of one portion of our Milton Central Ave Station district. Basically encompasses the northern part of the Milton Village business district. This is what we're calling the Milton Station Bridge sub-district. It bridges east and west. That's why we call it that. It's 2 parcels, Old Milton Hill House at 36 Elliott Street, and then New Milton Hill House at 50 Elliott Street. Milton Station West, again, more or less comprising the Central Ave Business District. You see 36 Central, 131 Elliott Street, the Steel and Rye Building, and then a handful of the other commercial buildings in that district. The Mattapan Station Subdistrict, primarily Unquity House, and then again, sort of a handful of single-family house lots. This is to get to that, this is one of those instances where there's a guideline requirement that you need to hit where, a sub-district has to be at least 5 acres. So the Unquity House site is a hair over 4 acres, and so we needed to fold in some additional land to get to that. The Blue Hills Parkway corridor, basically all of the parcels that front on Blue Hills Parkway down to the Tucker School, and as well as a handful off of some of the side streets over there. And then this is the Elliott Street corridor sub-district. So, this is a sub-district that has kind of had different shapes over the course of the time that we've been working with it. It's, by far the sort of most densely developed sub-district. It comprises the most number of parcels, has the most potential impacts on individual property owners. So it's been a particular focus, for kind of, just making sure that, we get those dimensional parameters right, we get those borders right. So when I say that, we've been kind of shaping these sub-districts both with, in terms of geography and in terms of, dimensional parameters to match the existing built form, looking at Milton Station East, as an example. This is a sub-district where the height limit is going to be 6 stories. And we went with 6 stories because we already have a 6-story building at 88 Wharf Street. And then a lot of the other sort of subsequent dimensional parameters in terms of setbacks, in terms of overall density, are meant to kind of mirror, that built form. You can say the same with the Milton Station West, Mattapan Station, another 6-story district, because again, Unquity House is already a 6-story building. So if Milton Residences for the Elderly decides that they ever want to redevelop this site, they get an additional bit of density, an additional handful of units, but the building that they could potentially redevelop is not very much larger than the existing building. And again, this is on purpose, because we're not trying to sort of put the town in a position where there's dramatic change all at once. The other thing that we're doing, and we'll show a more detailed, view of, what the compliance model outputs are, and then also the dimensional parameters. But, the other thing that we're doing, especially in the Elliott Street corridor, which again, you can see it encompasses many more parcels than any of the other subdistricts, is, setting a firm cap of 3 units per parcel eligible to be redeveloped. 3 units, as we mentioned earlier, is the smallest possible building you could build and still be considered multifamily. We are compelled by the guidelines to sort of zone in this area because of contiguity, because of area and unit count within the transit area. So there's no getting around zoning in the sort of the single-family residential zone. But what we're trying to do, and this is, again, based on planning efforts that we've done going back decades, one of the number one things is, the town values the physical character of your neighborhoods. And so, we have set, a density at the lowest level we possibly could, and set the dimensional parameters to really match what the existing built form is. And so that means, the same setbacks that are in the existing zoning, the same minimum lot size that's in the existing zoning, the same height limits as in the existing zoning. So, if there is development in the sub-district, we're doing our best to, A, prevent teardowns, and B, make sure that any new development is similar in physical character to what people already see in this area. So this is what sort of it looks like when you do your various inputs into the compliance model and kind of what it spits out. You see, I think there's 9 sub-districts here. They kind of, Granite Ave is one sub-district, Milton Station is one sub-district, but we broke them out into their constituent parts. You've got the max units per acre. This is, one thing I want to talk about with this is you probably recall at the very beginning, we talked about 15 units per acre is sort of the overall density that your zoning district needs to hit. So what are we doing with 45 units per acre? And that is because you can have a sub-district that is under the overall density that's required, and that's your Elliott Street corridor. The overall density of this is, where does it, do I have a model density? So the Elliott Street corridor is 5.9 units per acre, and the Blue Hills Parkway corridor is 10.3. So these are big geographies that are below the minimum required density that the state requires of us. And so what that means is you can do that, you can absolutely do that, but you've got to go elsewhere and make up for that with higher densities in other sub-districts. And so on some of the larger parcel sub-districts and some of the sub-districts where there's existing multifamily housing, we have kind of cranked up the density a little bit. But one thing I want to make sure is very clear to people is when we have, a density of 40 units per acre in the Milton Station West sub-district, 131 Elliott Street, the Hendry's building, is already 38 units per acre. So when we say 40 units per acre, we're basically saying, buildings that are the equivalent of the Hendry's building, which is something that's already been, permitted in this town. And, it's not quite open yet, but it's there. And I think it looks quite nice. Sort of that sort of explains why there are kind of fluctuations in the max density on some of these sub-districts. That next column is FAR. FAR means floor area ratio. That's basically a math problem that says if you have an area of this much, you are entitled to a fraction of that in buildable area in your building. And so, again, in some of the larger parcel subdistricts, we're at kind of 1 and 1.1 floor area ratio. And then in the sort of smaller parcel subdistricts, we're at a 0.7 to kind of, it's just another kind of way to kind of, a tool in the toolbox to kind of shape what these buildings look like. Max units per lot, like I said, on Elliott Street, no parcel will have 4 units on it. You can't do it. 3 units is the max. The other sub-districts, there is no limit because there are other parameters that are limiting the size of those projects. Max units per acre, the FAR, the height limits, the setback limits. Every sub-district except for Blue Hills Parkway has a 40% open space requirement. Blue Hills Parkway is a 50% open space requirement. And the next slide will have some additional parameters around, some of those other zoning dimensions. But that's what you put into the model. You say, these are our geographies, these are the dimensional parameters that affect unit count, and then it spits out what's on the right, which is the unit capacity number, which what unit capacity does is it pretends that your parcel map is a blank slate. So you put in these geographies that we put on our map, and the model says these are all undeveloped parcels. So if all of these parcels were blank, and you put this zoning into place, and then every single parcel was redeveloped, how many units could you get out of that zoning? And that's the unit capacity number. It is an analytical tool that the state has kind of created so that they can sort of, again, it's part of their 2-part definition of reasonable size district. Reasonable size is a geography, and reasonable size is how much stuff can you fit in that geography. It's an analytical tool. It's not a predictive tool, and we'll go into that in a little bit. No one is expecting for there to be 480 units in the Elliott Street corridor at any point under this zoning. The current number, there are 400. So in this geography, there are 410 housing units. Most of them are single family. Some of them are 2-family. There's a handful of 3s. One of the reasons why I say this with great confidence is that, like I said, the unit capacity number pretends that there's nothing on these parcels. And it says you put your zoning in place and every single parcel gets developed that's eligible under your parameters. How many units does that equal? Well, there's already stuff on these parcels. And not only is there stuff, there's people living in that stuff. So you've got hundreds of parcels here with owners that are going to make a decision at some point in their ownership of their house. Do I want to sell this house? Do I want to redevelop this house? Do I want to put an extra unit in this house? Do I want to put 2 extra units in this house? Some of them may say, yes, I want to do that. I want to do that today. Some of them will say, maybe that's something that I can look at down the line. Some of them will say, I love this single-family house, and I want to leave it to my kids, and it's going to be a single-family house forever. That's what we're dealing with when we deal with unit capacity. It's a tool that the state uses to kind of judge zoning. It's not a planning tool that we use to say, all right, what are we going to do when every single property owner with an eligible parcel on Elliott Street decides they want to put a triple-decker on their house? That's not what's going to happen. Yes?
Sorry, so you said Elliott Street currently has 410 units.
Yes.
Are you saying that with this, there would be an additional 480 on top of that?
So this is where it gets complicated. So I have access to it, and if I can dig it up, I can dig it up. But one of the dimensional parameters that we have for the Elliott Street subdistrict is not only that there's a max of 3 units per developable parcel, but we also have a minimum lot size of 7,500 square feet, right? So, there's no kind of parcel sizes here, but what I want to tell you is that actually more than half of the parcels in the subdistrict are less than 7,500 square feet. So that's kind of step one when you walk into the building department to get a building permit. If you want to put a single-family house on a parcel in the town of Milton, they say, show us a survey that tells us what your lot size is. And if you were to walk in with a 7,499 square foot parcel, you would not be able to get your building permit because you're on an undersized parcel, you're not eligible. So slightly less than 50% of the parcels in this subdistrict have the size to do a 3-unit project if they wanted to. And so when we talk about what the unit capacity is, we're actually only talking about unit capacity that's developed on those eligible parcels. And again, they're kind of smattered throughout, but you can kind of see where the bigger ones are and where the smaller ones are. So that is, that's sort of the net new unit figure is, it's a little bit tougher to do in the Elliott Street corridor because there are eligible parcels and ineligible parcels, but it's a little bit easier to do, in the Mattapan Station corridor, for instance, or in the Mattapan Station subdistrict, where we know there are 139 units at Unquity House. And we know that the unit capacity under the zoning would allow, I think, 170. So the net new units on that parcel, we can do that math very quickly. It's 40-something units. So, that's a number that people are interested in because it basically kind of starts to help you understand what is going to be the real potential impact of this stuff. Not that there's going to be 2461 units, because we already have a certain number of units that are already in these districts. So, what is the figure that's kind of, the one minus the other? I hesitate to go too much deeper into that because even that number is, again, it suffers from the same issue as the unit capacity number. Because again, even though it adds that one more facet of context, like, okay, there's actually already units on these parcels, it still kind of assumes that all of those parcels that are eligible are going to get redeveloped, and they won't. Another thing that, I think is really important to understand is, relative to this sort of thing is, we are generating a certain amount of unit capacity out of Milton Station West, right? And I'm going to move back and forth. We're off script, by the way. So Milton Station West has a unit capacity of 108 units. So our zoning right now, as we're proposing it, you could build 108 units in that geography. In real life, 36 Central, the one at the bottom, it might be 10 years old, maybe 11 or 12 years old. That's a relatively new building with 18 units on it. 131 Elliott Street, the Hendry's project, not even fully sold yet. So for the purposes of this zoning and for the purposes of the compliance model that the state is using, we are saying, you can build 40 units on the Hendry's project, but you'll never see 40 new units on that Hendry's project. That building just got built. And that condo association is not going to say, let's demolish our building and then build a new one for 2 extra units. So on paper, we are getting credit for unit capacity on that parcel. And in real life, we will never see a redevelopment of that parcel. And, you can say that for a lot of the parcels that we're doing. I think in, the Milton Station Bridge District is another great example. And this is one where it goes both ways. 50 Elliott Street, the new Milton Hill House, the sort of yellow and green apartment building over there by the train tracks, again, might be less than 10 years old if it's 10 years old. So that is a building that is there and is going to stay there for quite some time. Now, the old Milton Hill House at 36 Elliott Street, built in the 60s, big site, kind of an anachronistic site plan from a parking perspective. The building is long in the tooth. That may be a redevelopment opportunity for that owner under this zoning. I can't tell you when, but that is one where, if I were a betting person and I had to put my money on one of these parcels, I'd put my money on that parcel. So one of the things that we're being very deliberate about when we draw these subdistricts is taking advantage of the existing multifamily that we have. Now, we don't have any compliant districts where we could say to the state, this district is already compliant, we're done. But what we do have is some of these multifamily buildings that we already, have and can kind of put zoning under, bank those units, and then, not have to worry about those impacts from a new development. 88 Wharf Street, another great example, 73 units in a relatively new building. We're getting credit for unit capacity there, but there's not going to be a project under the zoning for decades, if ever. So just to sort of get back to this one real quick, the green kind of row at the bottom kind of shows what our kind of target outputs are. And so our unit capacity, we're required to do 2461. We're at 2625 under this zoning, which is a little bit over. It's tough to land the plane exactly on the spot. And so what we found is if you want to get closer to 2461 and you turn the dial on one district, it kind of brings down other numbers. And so this is it's kind of where we're at. The acreage of our district, 145, way over the minimum of 50, so we're very much in the clear there. And then our overall density at 15.3, 3/10 over the required density of 15 units per acre. So we believe that we're compliant. We have actually submitted a version of this zoning to the state for a kind of a pre-town meeting check. They've said that we could do that to sort of, we think we're compliant. Do you think we're compliant? Because eventually, if and when town meeting passes this zoning, the test is you send your zoning language and you send your compliance model documents to the state, and they kind of give it a real good look, and they say, yes, you're compliant, or no, you're not compliant. This is the detailed zoning parameters for each of these subdistricts. I talked about a bunch of them already, but I think one thing that you'll find is that some of these subdistricts, we had to kind of create new parameters, and those are based on, what are we doing with the existing multifamily that's here. In the Elliott Street corridor, all of those zoning parameters are the C district zoning parameters. 15-foot setback in the front, 20-foot setback in the rear, 20 feet of combined side setback. That's in our zoning today. Same thing with the building height. 2.5 stories, 35 feet on Elliott Street. Same thing on Blue Hills Parkway. Same thing in East Milton Square. The thing about East Milton Square that we're doing that I want to make sure that everyone's aware of, and hopefully you are aware, but if you're not, you will be, we've got a sort of concurrent zoning effort going on in East Milton Square. Kind of predates MBTA community zoning. We've been out in East Milton for years, talking to folks, trying to sort of figure out what is our vision for the built environment in East Milton. And so we are at the very start of a process that will hopefully end up in a mixed-use overlay zone for special permit zoning in East Milton, similar to what we did in Milton Village, which is hopefully going to start to bear fruit in the very near future. So the reason that we're zoning East Milton for MBTA communities is because we came to the decision that, we want to rezone East Milton anyway. We're trying to do it. We've been planning for it. We've started a process. We're going to be doing it. Let's get credit here. Again, bank those units of unit capacity, and then pass the zoning that we really want later on. And so, a big difference between the MBTA community zoning and the zoning that we're hoping to pass is, I think in all likelihood, that future zoning is going to be a special permit zoning, which basically means, the planning board has a lot more discretion over whether or not they issue a permit. There are a lot more rigorous conditions that we can place on development, and there's a lot more kind of benefit that we can extract from development, via affordable housing, via streetscape improvements, via, all the different things that we like to do in special permit zoning. And so the thought behind East Milton Square right now is, let's get the credit under MBTA communities. Let's set what we think is a credible set of conditions for redevelopment. But when we do our special permit zoning, that will be the option that is much more attractive to the development community. They will want to use that zoning more than they want to use this zoning. And I think one thing that you see here, 2.5 stories of height in East Milton Square, which is, as you can kind of see, is the same height as a house on Elliott Street. We're thinking that, under the special permit, we're going to be a lot more targeted about a little bit more height here, a little bit more density there, really start trying to figure out kind of what works for that district, again, in a way that's going to be much more attractive to the development community. So, again, these are the parameters. As I said, we've done our best to match what the existing built environment is. Where there is an existing built environment to match, there are some places where there just isn't. And so that's what we're working on, with these zoning parameters. One thing I want to talk about real quick is our mandatory mixed-use district. I mentioned earlier, I'll go way, way back to the map. The Milton Station subdistricts, the sort of the yellow and the green one, those two portions that are kind of hatched with the black lines, those are going to be our designated mandatory mixed-use districts. When the compliance guidelines first came out, they basically said that you can allow mixed use in your zoning. It could be something that if someone wants to do mixed use, they can, but you can't require it. You can't say, if you are building in this district, you have to do a ground floor commercial component. And there are a lot of reasons why the state did that, but a lot of towns kind of cried foul because, if you think about some of the districts that we're proposing, or if you think about, town of Brookline, which is, trying to rezone the Harvard Street corridor between Coolidge Corner and Brookline Village, that's the heart of their commercial district. So what the fear was among a number of communities, including town of Milton, was that, okay, if we rezone the places that we think are appropriate for multifamily housing, Milton Village, close to transit, in the transit area, but we don't require mixed use, what's going to prevent a property owner from, taking a commercial building and developing it into a strictly multifamily building? We're losing commercial tax base, which we desperately need. We don't have a lot of commercial tax base. What can we do to kind of keep that? And so communities all across the region were kind of talking about this. And so there was an update to the compliance guidelines that basically said, okay, it's very complicated because in land use law, 88 Wharf may not look that different from 50 Elliott Street. They're kind of almost next door to each other. They're different architecture, but you think they're both kind of apartment buildings. But they're actually completely distinct land uses from a land use law perspective. 50 Elliott Street is strictly a multifamily building. The only thing that's in there is apartments. And 88 Wharf, even though 80% of it is apartments, that's a different land use because it's mixed use. It's got a commercial component on the ground floor and then apartments above. So the law treats those two uses differently. And the MBTA Communities Law, Section 3A, specifically says that you've got to have a multifamily district. So it doesn't talk to anything about mixed use. And so I'm starting to overcomplicate things. I'm going to pull back from the overcomplication and just say that because mixed use is a different land use, they had to come up with a kind of complicated scheme to allow us to do required mixed use. And so we're doing that. And basically it means that, we're going to have a separate article after the main MBTA Communities article that says we want to amend that article and make these portions of the Milton Village district a mandatory mixed-use district. That kind of takes those units out of the calculation for some of our metrics for MBTA communities, leaves them in for others. It's complicated. The upshot is if town meeting passes both of those articles, we will be able to mandate a mixed-use component in those Milton Station East and West subdistricts, preserving the commercial tax base there. The reason why we're doing Milton Village and not East Milton is because we're restricted to a certain amount of our zoning districts where we can utilize this. And we felt that because we're going to be in the process of rezoning East Milton again in the future, that we would do a required mixed-use component in that new zoning, which, as I just mentioned, we're planning on that being the more attractive development option. So we have both of our commercial districts covered in different ways. So I've said this, and I forgot that I had these slides, or else I would have waited to do this. But just basically the sort of the concept of a kind of a timeline of development, and we have done our best to fashion these districts in a way that there's no potential for everything to happen overnight. And the Milton Station subdistrict is a great example, and I mentioned this. 131 Elliott Street, literally just built. 36 Central, 13 years old. 50 Elliott Street, 9 years old. These are buildings that are not going to be redeveloped in any kind of time scale that we need to worry about. Old Milton Hill House, potentially 1964. That building may be considered sort of towards the end of its useful life. But for the purposes of MBTA community zoning, all we need to do is pass compliant zoning, and we're in the clear, all right? Whenever these developments happen or don't happen is irrelevant to the state for the purposes of compliance under this zoning. And so we have done our best to craft these sub-districts in a way that there are some parcels that may be developed in the sort of near to medium term. There are some parcels that will be developed in the long term. There are some parcels that may, frankly, never be developed. And so this goes back to that unit capacity number that I was talking about. You know, it's a theoretical number because, again, in any reasonable time frame, there's no possibility for 2,641 units to be redeveloped in the town of Milton for this exact type of reason. I mentioned site plan review. Sir, real quick.
Didn't we have that same conversation about the lot down by, where is it, down by Mattapan Station, for instance? What was the one that was along the stretch there, right there? What about that, as far as not being developed?
Well,
Under this plan?
Well, so I mean, this one's a slightly different story, obviously, because you know there are hundreds of parcels here. I don't know the age of every one of them. They do tend to be older housing. There's not a ton of newer houses here. It's a different calculus when it comes to single family, because again, you've got how many different individual property owners that live in a house and live in a community and have maybe they're relatively new and they want to raise their kid in a single family house. Maybe they want to leave a house to their family. Maybe they, have been really trying to build an extra unit or two to bring in, some extra money or to bring in a family member. They might want to avail themselves of that zoning. I think in a district like the Elliott Street corridor, you have to kind of, consider that there are as many parcels as there are. That's as many different kind of thought processes about redevelopment. And this is a situation where these aren't developers. These are people. This is you. I mean, I don't know where you all live, but if you live on Elliott Street, this is the conversation that you're having with yourself. This is the conversation that your neighbors are having. You could have it with your neighbors, Do you want to redevelop under the zoning or not? Some people may want to. Others may not. But I think the one thing about a district like this compared to some of the other districts that have larger parcels is, these are small parcels and the amount of development that's allowed on any given parcel is the smallest possible, 3 units in a multifamily building. And so even if there's a relatively quick pace of redevelopment, which would, in a town like Milton would be a handful of redevelopments in a given calendar year. We're talking about 3, 6, 9, 12, 15 units at a time over the course of 6 months, a year, multiple years. I don't want to predict the timeline, but what I'm saying is every project that gets redeveloped is only adding, well, it's not even adding 3 units, it's adding 1 unit or 2 units depending on, what's already there. So the impact of the change, even if it's quick, is more organic and more kind of dispersed than if you were rezoning a large parcel for large buildings, which we are in certain parts of town. And there are other reasons why we think there are some parcels that may redevelop sooner than other ones. So the Elliott Street corridor, again, is one where, again, the potential redevelopment is relatively small, and so the impact of any given development is relatively small.
You haven't mentioned Granite Ave, and it seems to, the numbers, it seems to be, Granite Ave is the north and south are 2 of the largest
Yep.
impacted. It's also a feeder from the highway, the traffic. It's also one that has a large 40B on the table, as well as feeding into East Milton Square. We've talked a lot about Elliott Street, which is fantastic, but we haven't talked a lot about that area. And I don't know if that's because, you said the overlay is on the table, but that's a piece that's going to impact everybody, no matter where you live, because if they're taking the highway or have to get through town, and there's already really large projects on the table there that are likely going to get through in some capacity. So can you address that a bit?
Yeah. So you're talking about residents at East Milton on Franklin Street, the 40B?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the one that, is that, by Mechanic Street, is that the, yeah. That's not a
Not a 40B, but it's an apartment building.
regardless, it's another apartment building.
So the Granite Ave district. So 40B is it's never a good thing to talk about, but it's a relevant thing to talk about because I think when we talk about 40B and we talk about MBTA communities, we're talking about mandates that are coming down from the state. So 40B is a statute that's passed in 1969 that basically was meant to kind of, what the state saw was that a lot of communities were passing really strict and frankly exclusionary zoning that prevented multifamily from being built in their towns. And so what the state did was they passed a law that said they invented this thing called the subsidized housing inventory, which was a sort of a catalog of all of the deed-restricted affordable housing in your town. And if the number of housing units on your subsidized housing inventory was less than 10% of your overall housing stock, then what a developer could do would be to propose a project. And if that project included 25% or more deed-restricted affordable housing units, they could basically circumvent zoning. The mechanism is a waiver of all kind of local requirements. And so how you see that manifest itself in the East Milton project, and we've had 6 others in the recent past, is the East Milton project is on about an acre of land on Franklin Street and Bassett Street. And they are proposing, well, it started as 100-something, but it got down to 94 units in a 6-story building. We don't have any zoning that comes close to that. And so because we are below 10% on our subsidized housing inventory, that developer could come in and say 25% of our 94 units are going to be affordable, and so we get to build this big, huge building. We are, as a town, not necessarily compelled to approve it, but very, very, very strongly incentivized to not disapprove it. Because the mechanism for relief, if we reject a 40B, is the developer then goes to the state, and the state says, you've got to let them build that 40B. So this is something that was meant to spur multifamily housing development in towns like Milton. So we've got one of those in East Milton. And to sort of go back to the point I was making, that is a state, not necessarily mandate, but a way for the state to kind of get around local zoning to get multifamily done. MBTA communities is another similar type of thing, where they're saying, we're not going to let the developers come in and tell you what to do. We're going to let you figure out what to do, but you've got to do it. And so, this is why we're here. And this is why we're looking at Mattapan Station. This is why we're looking at Elliott Street. This is why we're looking at Granite Ave. The Granite Ave parcels, and there's a couple things that are kind of animating our choices around where we're going to rezone. One of them is, we've got to do a certain amount around transit. Another one is you've got to do a certain, we want to take advantage of existing multifamily properties. Another principle is, when you look around the town of Milton, compared to other kind of suburbs, compared to Dedham, compared to Norwood, compared to Westwood, we don't have these huge expanses of commercial or underutilized industrial or brownfield land that, other towns have been able to take advantage for multifamily housing developments. Dedham is a great example when it comes to MBTA communities. Town of Dedham, basically, they have a commuter rail station not far from Legacy Place. There are a handful of 40Bs that have been approved over there, and they just basically drew a circle around those 40Bs and Legacy Place and said, that's our zoning district. And, if Legacy Place ever wants to redevelop into a bunch of huge apartment buildings, they can do it. We don't have a lot of that. And so we are out in the single-family neighborhoods. We are out in historic districts in Milton Village. We are in our kind of largest and densest commercial district. And we're on Granite Ave, where to the extent that we have larger commercial or, this is not necessarily an industrial parcel, but it's a quasi-industrial use, can we utilize these parcels, again, to get unit capacity and to kind of put development in a place where it's, relatively appropriate? So 100% hear the concern that, this is a feeder to the expressway. This is an area that is already kind of choked by traffic. The sad truth, and I said this at the warrant committee the other day, and I don't mean to dismiss the issue, but traffic is bad everywhere in town. There's not one sub-district that we're looking at where, we're going to pull out of the driveway and, we'll be downtown in a few minutes. Blue Hills Parkway over by the Mattapan Station subdistrict is a mess. I ride my bike down Central Ave, and, that stop sign at Central Ave and Elliott Street, is a mess. This is not a unique kind of, situation on Granite Ave. One thing that we're trying to do is, and again, this is where I say, like, we're doing our best to kind of fashion these districts in a way that, takes advantage of, if not kind of physical, kind of built environment kind of factors, what are the other factors that we can do to kind of make sure that there's not, again, dramatic change, overnight. So, the Flatley building is a commercial building. I don't know if the Flatley company wants to redevelop or not. This building, as far as I know, is still a going concern. But it is also, I mean, you can see from the map, it's as far as you can get in Milton and still be in Milton. And so, from an impact perspective, and a lot of people are going to want to go south to go north on the expressway. But a lot of people are gonna go on Granite Ave, and then it's my problem. I live in Neponset Circle. This is one where, when you can kind of do your best to kind of put those impacts as far from existing residential neighborhoods as you can, we want to try to take advantage of that. The state site is another example, and it represents a kind of a wrinkle in the guidelines. The guidelines actually, and you can kind of see this if you know this is on our maps. It actually prohibits you from, or it doesn't give you credit for unit capacity on public land. So you can imagine, towns, if there wasn't that rule, would, let's rezone town hall for 1,000 units. No one's ever going to tear down town hall for 1,000 units, and so you've kind of skirted zoning. So they don't want you rezoning public parcels, except under two conditions. If there's a recent history of attempted disposition for housing purposes, you can zone for a public parcel. And if a parcel is identified as a strategic housing site in your housing production plan, which is approved by the state. State DPW yard is identified in the housing production plan as a potential housing site if the state ever wanted to dispose of it. There was a recent attempt at disposition back in 2014. We actually put together a study group to kind of analyze different land uses over there. The day after that report went public, they kind of pulled the land off. So that's been, a salt shed and maintenance yard and park and ride lot for however long. The thing that represents a relatively unique proposition for the state site on Granite Ave is the fact that the state is not bound by local zoning. So I mentioned that sort of previous attempt at disposition. Following that, there was a discussion about, well, maybe we want to put a MassDOT regional headquarters building on the Granite Ave site, which again, we don't have multifamily zoning. We don't have MassDOT headquarters zoning either. So whatever that building was going to be, if they decided to build it, they would be able to build it. And that goes for any of a number of uses that the state would potentially want to do. Now, if they decide to dispose of that land for housing purposes, that zoning exemption kind of goes away. But what we see in community after community when there are state dispositions of land for housing purposes is what I would consider to be a more collaborative process than strictly a developer coming into the building permit office and trying to get their building permit. The state, and they've said that it's a priority to use state land for affordable housing purposes. So whether or not we pass the zoning or not, this parcel was always going to be something that we would have to keep an eye on. And so from an ownership perspective, we have some level of confidence that we have more of a partner in the state for collaboration and cooperation than if this were a privately owned parcel. I think the other really unique and kind of hopeful thing about Granite Ave is it's a state-owned site and it's a state-owned road. Granite Ave is a MassDOT road in this portion. And so any development that happens on a state road needs a MassDOT access permit in order to put all your traffic onto a state road. And so that in itself represents a synergy between a potential project and its potential impacts and the potential to actually improve those impacts and do something about them. Because if Granite Ave was a town road in this portion, we would have to figure that out. Where is the driveway going to be? Do we need to put a signal in? Where is this traffic going to go? And every project under these zonings, by the way, is going to require a traffic impact analysis that we're going to take a look at. And again, that's subject to site plan review, the traffic and circulation plan. So again, Granite Ave represents a opportunity to work with a state partner who is in a position to do, and actually required, frankly, under the Mass Dot access permit, to do the necessary improvements that would be necessary in order to kind of mitigate, the impacts. The other thing I want to say about Granite Ave, and this is again why this is a theme that I'm trying to hit on, why that overall unit capacity number is not the best for trying to kind of predict what's actually going to happen, is unit capacity only takes into account what we put into the model, which is a geography and then dimensional parameters, setbacks, height, density, etc. Doesn't take into account any other on-the-ground conditions, doesn't take into account any other land use regulations that the town may have. So it's been said by folks who live there and know for a fact, and anyone that's looked at a firm map also knows, that almost all of that state site is on the FEMA flood insurance rate map flood zone, right? We have in our zoning a floodplain overlay, which basically says take the FEMA flood map, put it over your town map, and anything that's proposed in that flood zone has an extra set of requirements under the town zoning. One of those is about, information about flood pathways and things like that. Another is that every project in the flood zone is subject to the Wetlands Protection Act. And so in addition to going through the planning board for site plan review, they will also have to go through the Conservation Commission for an order of conditions, to make sure that any development is sensitive to flood pathways and is not exacerbating flooding, elsewhere in town. The other thing that our floodplain overlay zone requires of projects is they are responsible for building under the building in a floodplain provisions of the state building code, which again, the state understands that we are a coastal state and a lot of the most attractive property is in the flood zone. I used to work in city of Boston. We permit things in the seaport all the time. People criticize us for it. But you can build and design around those issues. And the state building code requires you to do it. And one of the things, again, that the compliance model and the unit capacity figure is not taking into account is the fact that when you're building in a floodplain, you're required to build a certain number of feet above the flood elevation. So if the ground is here and the flood zone says the water comes here, you've got to build your lowest floor up here, right? And so, people say, oh, the building's going to be on stilts. Maybe it's not stilts, but your lowest floor needs to be above the flood. That eats into your zoning height. So if we have a height limit of 60 feet in this zone, a portion of that is eaten up by elevation over flood. We could decide to give projects credit for that, or we can decide you've got 60 feet of height, figure it out. That eats into unit count. That eats into the feasibility of a project, where you can build on the site, how much you can build on the site. So we've heard a lot from folks on not on Granite Ave, but some folks on Granite Ave, but folks in that neighborhood. We're taking those comments to heart. We're doing some work. We've already increased the setback, in this sub-district to kind of give a little bit more space, off of the street. We're trying to see if we can move some of that unit capacity around. But it's really important to understand that the number that you see coming out of the compliance model is going to be affected by other factors. Now, obviously, it's a lot of units irrespective of whether it goes down by 100 or 200 or whatever. But there are other reasons why we believe that there's a better chance to mitigate those impacts than elsewhere.
I have a question regarding, so the state mandates, so if hypothetically this goes through, right, they're building all these units on this, what about the infrastructure of the town? What about our fire department, our school system? Like, is the state funding the town to increase that? Like, we have a brand new fire station with one fire truck going
Oh, yeah, we've been doing a little loosey goosey with that. So let's. I'm gonna try to get. I'm gonna answer this question, and then I'm gonna try to get through the rest of my slides, and then we can do official because that mic is hooked up. So sorry to all the folks that are watching at home. So the answer is no. The requirement on the part of the town is to create zoning. Now, obviously, the zoning is meant to create development, but from the state's perspective, this is not a production mandate. So the town is not on the hook for actually making sure that buildings get built. We're on the hook for actually creating the zoning. From the perspective of those municipal impacts, those are things that the town is going to need to do. The planning board has commissioned a fiscal impact analysis. We've got a firm that's looking at what is going to be the sort of the incremental increase in police calls, fire calls, children in the schools, other infrastructure kind of issues, based on a sort of a perspective kind of level of build out. And so it's kind of a cost benefit analysis of like, okay, you're going to need this many new cops, you're going to need this many new teachers, you may need new facilities, but also what are you getting on the tax revenue side, and how does that all kind of wash out? So we are anticipating the results of that analysis soon. One thing I think it's important to understand is that it's important information to have for the warrant committee, for the select board, for the town, moving forward. We've got to pass the zoning, because if we don't, then we're in trouble. And one of the things that there's been speculation around, and we talked about 40B earlier, where 40B is a situation where developers come in and kind of build what they want because the town hasn't allowed them to build it in the past. And one of the sort of potential scenarios for non-compliant communities is, the law says that we have to have a zoning district. So if we don't, what prevents a property owner from proposing a project that meets all of the compliance guidelines, but we don't have zoning to build it? That is a case that could potentially lead to what's called a builder's remedy, which is kind of what 40B is. So I think there's speculation that, at the state level, no one's getting away with anything by not complying. It's just you've got an opportunity to pass zoning that you believe works the best for you, or you can leave it to the developers later on. So I think the question of, can we afford to do this? Can we not afford to do this? I think the initial kind of results that we've seen from fiscal impact analysis and the experience that we have, from our own multifamily development that we have in town is that this is actually, revenue positive. And so those impacts on infrastructure, those impacts on town services actually are offset by increased tax revenue. But again, that's a question. Your taxes wouldn't go up. No, but the new guy pays more taxes, right? In a Prop 2.5 environment, like your taxes can only go up a certain amount a year unless there's an override. But the new growth is exempt from the tax levy limit. So when a new multifamily building goes up, 88 Wharf, we get $1 million a year out of 88 Wharf. That is $1 million in new tax revenue that we get every year that is not subject to the levy limit. And now that's money in the bank. And now that sets a new levy limit that, and again, 88 Wharf is a building that there are 0 school children coming out of 88 Wharf. And it's in an area that has existing pipes, existing streets, very little infrastructure impact in a project like that. And so that is a revenue generator for the town. And so we're proposing a lot of projects like that potentially. So I think what we're going to find is that these are revenue positive projects. But I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that we still have to pass the zoning, and we still have to figure out a way to sort of deal with those things down the line. So I'm going to try to get through the rest of my slides, and then we can get to questions after, and we can have people up at the podium. So we talked about mandatory mixed use. We talked about the way that we develop the sub-districts. We talked a little bit about site plan review. This is a way for the planning board. The planning board can't reject a project under site plan review, but they can put conditions on a project that shape it from a design perspective, shape it from a site planning perspective, put conditions on lighting, put conditions on landscaping, so that these projects, fit the best as they possibly can, within the existing context. There are also development standards in the zoning, and this basically means, outside of the sort of the physical measurements of height and setback and everything like that, there are other sort of programmatic things around the site. And so, parking maximums for residential uses, for instance, this is a big concern in a lot of places, where the question is, well, everyone's going to have a car, and where are they going to park their car? MBTA communities zoning, for the most part, the way that we're trying to operationalize it is transit and amenity oriented. I think there are very few of our sub-districts that you would consider to be not proximate to transit or to commercial amenities, where you have the potential to live a car light lifestyle. Typically, when zoning has parking requirements, they set a parking minimum, so that you say you've got a building and it's got to have at least this many parking spaces per unit. And if you want to do more, go ahead, but you can't do less. And what we found all across the country, and specifically in our region, is that zoning and sort of planners, and I'll say this just fine, are not the best judges of how many parking spaces a project actually needs. The developers who are out there doing this work every day and selling units and renting units and kind of experiencing these projects and what the needs of their tenants and their buyers are really have a much better and more nuanced view of how much parking is required. And so when you set a parking maximum, you say, look, we don't want more parking spaces than this. And if you can do less, then great. And it really puts the onus on that judgment on the part of the people who are actually making the decision and having to actually market the units. One thing that I just note here, that the Metropolitan Area Planning Council surveyed 200 different multifamily buildings in the inner core Boston region, and found that an average of 30% of the zoning required parking spaces in those 200 developments were empty in the peak time. So overnight for residential buildings, during the day for commercial buildings. So what that says is, when your zoning says you've got to build 100 parking spaces, you actually only need to build 70 parking spaces, because 30% of those are going to be empty and you don't need them. Parking is the least efficient, least productive land use. Almost anything is better to build than parking: open space, another housing unit, commercial space. You don't want to overpark these facilities, again, because we're trying to build transit-oriented projects. We're trying to build projects where these developments will select for people that want to use the trolley, that want to live in a business district, and sort of, be close to those walkable amenities.
What amenities can you walk to from Granite Avenue?
So I mentioned that most, if not all, of our sub-districts were transit-oriented and walkable. I think you hit the nail on the head that the Granite Ave portion is probably the one that's not. We have set a higher parking maximum in the Granite Ave district than we have in the other districts, out of an acknowledgement that, yes, people are going to need to have a car more so than in other districts. I would argue that, 2 Granite Ave is more walkable to Adams Village than it is to other places. People will do that. But I think the other thing is again, we're allowing mixed use in these projects. So we're hoping that, these projects will also create their own kind of commercial center of gravity. So, that is one example where, it's not as walkable as other districts, but we've tried to kind of acknowledge that in that parking maximum figure. So open space and recreation development standards. There are open space requirements. There are usable open space requirements for larger projects. We're requiring there to be, an area where families with kids can actually, play. This is a criticism that we've heard in some of the 40B projects, where the building area and the lot is maxed out, and where's Johnny going to play ball? We want to make sure that these projects are not kind of just sort of isolated, and you've got to go across Granite Ave to get somewhere. Design standards are, again, things that are in zoning that affect the building orientation, the orientation of the entrance to the building, the site plan, so that, again, we're trying to give the planning board as many tools as we can to shape these projects in a way that is consistent and harmonious with the existing physical context. So affordable housing, the original guidelines that came out actually did not have any provision for affordable housing. This is one of the first things that communities kind of noticed and said, this isn't going to fly. In a town like Milton, which is below 10% on their subsidized housing inventory, but really trying hard to get above, we need to be able to require subsidized, deed-restricted affordable units. So a subsequent update of the guidelines allowed for a maximum of 10% of units in a project could be required to be deed-restricted affordable. So we are availing ourselves of that. The guidelines also say that you can increase that ratio if you have an independent third-party financial analysis that says if you go from 10% to 12%, you can still have a feasible project. Because what they don't want to do is see towns set an artificially high affordability requirement that then makes projects infeasible to build, in which case you get no housing. You can set a 25% affordability requirement, but 25% of 0 units is 0. So you want to make sure you set that level at a reasonable level. There's a lot of discussion around the Mattapan trolley. Mattapan trolley is considered by HLC to be an extension of the Red Line. This is what makes Milton a rapid transit community. Mattapan trolley doesn't look like the Red Line. It doesn't look quite like the Green Line, but it will. A trip that originates at Capon Street on the Mattapan trolley will get you to Downtown Crossing faster than a trip that originates at Boston College, faster than a trip that originates at Riverside in Newton, faster than a trip that originates at Braintree, which is undisputably the Red Line. So HLC considers it to be rapid transit. It's got an exclusive right-of-way. It has it has the frequencies that kind of differentiate it from commuter rail. Commuter rail runs every half hour, sometimes doesn't run on the weekends. Mattapan trolley runs, as you see, every 6 minutes in the peak hour, every 12 minutes elsewhere, 7 days a week. We're gonna wait until after, because people.
Consider there are 2 headways when you talk about taking Mattapan
So we've got someone in the audience saying that there are 2 headways. So you have to get off the Mattapan trolley, get on the Ashland train. When I say that if you start at Capon Street, it means you get off at Ashmont and get on the Ashmont train, and you're still getting there faster than if you got on at Riverside. That's what I'm saying. It takes that additional headway into account. Understood. The MBTA is currently engaged in a Mattapan line transformation project. This is a project that is meant to upgrade our stations and upgrade the rolling stock on the Mattapan trolley from the historic PCC cars to what are currently the newest cars on the Green Line. They're called Type 9 cars. Those have a higher capacity. They fit more people in every individual car. They run more reliably. They'll be newer. They don't require a blacksmith shop to fabricate new parts. And they also run in the snow, which is something that the PCC cars don't. If you ever sort of have to take the Mattapan trolley in a snowstorm, you're not taking the Mattapan trolley, you're taking a bus.
That doesn't just happen in the winter. That phenomenon.
Understood. And what I'm saying is that the new cars will not have that problem, which is why that Mattapan line transformation project is so important. It's got $127 million behind it to get to a design stage where they can start to procure implementation funds through capital budget.
And when is it being delivered?
Sir, we're going to wait until the end for comments, so thank you. I'm sure everyone's aware of the recent shutdown of the Mattapan and Ashmont lines. That work just completed over the weekend, meant to eliminate the slow zones on the line that are kind of the result of old, defective, kind of in need of maintenance tracks that cause drivers to need to slow down. It creates a real big problem for getting to your destination on time. Estimated that those improvements will improve commute times on the Ashmont line by 33 minutes and on the Mattapan line by 5 minutes. The drivers are a fan already in the couple days that those improvements have been operational. I include this slide just to show that, I understand that there has been a long history of, well, they say they're going to improve the Mattapan line, and what are they going to do? And I think what you've seen in the last month is the T is in a position now where they are ready to put the resources behind improvements that have a demonstrable impact on the commute for Milton residents that use the Mattapan trolley. I've used this slide before. I'm sorry for the formatting. The computer here doesn't have my font, so I did this in a different font. We've talked before in previous forums about, that vehicle miles and sort of transportation is the number one contributor to greenhouse gases in the United States, and that the number one thing that any individual city or town can do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and these are huge global issues, but everyone can do something. And the thing that towns can do is change their land use regulations to encourage people to live in transit-oriented, walkable areas where they're not depending on their car to do everything. This has an impact. We've heard comments, and I get it. People live here. People have certain habits that they've sort of, been living, their entire lives. But we've heard, you're going to put these things on Elliott Street. You're going to put these things, in East Milton Square. Everyone's going to have a car. No one takes the Mattapan trolley. What I hear when I hear that is that like a better world isn't possible. And I don't believe that. I believe that a better world is possible. I think that, and these are surveys from this year. The National Association of Realtors. Buyers are willing to pay more to live in walkable communities. 79% of residents rate walkability as very or somewhat important. 78% say they pay more for a home in a walkable community. 90% of Gen Z and millennial respondents indicating they pay more for a home in a walkable community. People want to live in places where they don't have to get in their car and drive everywhere they need to go. And this is a generational thing. 62% of 17-year-olds had a license in 1997, 42% in 2021. So not only is this kind of bearing itself out in polling, it's bearing itself out in real life. Young people that are aging into moving out of mom's house, buying a house, starting a family, have a priority for walkable living that previous generations did not have. When we talk about MBTA communities as good climate policy, we also talk about flooding, we talk about stormwater, we talk about where are the responsible places to develop versus where is it not very responsible to develop. And what I'm going to show you on these next couple slides is a map that overlays the impervious surface of every parcel in town. This is the layer that DPW uses to measure your stormwater fee. So this is East Milton. The red sort of lines are impervious surface, so kind of a line around the house and a line around the driveway. This is a proxy for, development. The dirt is naturally pervious, and asphalt and your roof are impervious. So, East Milton, very highly developed. This portion of the, the state DPW yard site, considered to be impervious surface. Big parking lot, maintenance yard. The American Legion site obviously is mostly parking lot. 2 Granite Ave, almost entirely paved over in the buildable portion. This is Milton Village and Central Ave. Again, you're seeing a lot of red because these are areas that we've already developed. This is one of the oldest parts of town, formerly industrial. It's been developed for hundreds of years. This is where development has already happened. This is on the west side of town, so that western part of the Elliott Street corridor, Mattapan Station District, Blue Hills Parkway District. This is where development has already happened. This is where, when you redevelop these properties, you are not digging up new, fresh, pristine woodland. You are not regrading previously untouched land. You are not taking down dozens, if not hundreds, of trees. This is the zoning that we are trying to put into place, is zoning that takes advantage of existing infrastructure, zoning that takes advantage of existing areas where, to the extent that there are stormwater impacts, to the extent that there are heat island effects impacts, this is where we've already done them. What I'm going to show you next is what Milton zoning today allows. Legally, today, you can do any of this stuff that I'm about to show you, and you've been able to do it since 1938. This is 227 Pleasant Street, Pine Gardens Way. So this is a bit of a time lapse of the development of that. That's a 5-unit subdivision built under our subdivision regulations. This is a project that went to the planning board a few years ago. Ton of regrading, ton of trees come down for 5 single-family house lots in a C zone. This one is Beechwood Road off of Brush Hill Road. So another relatively new subdivision off of Brush Hill Road. This is going to wind up being 5 or 6 houses. You can see, there might have been one house there with a huge backyard with woods in the back, and now you see where all those trees went. This is, at the bottom is Fletcher Steele Way off of Highland Street, and you can start to see as this one goes along, you'll also see the development of Marine Road off of Highland Street. Fletcher Steele Way is a traditional subdivision under our subdivision regs. Marine Road is a cluster subdivision. That requires a special permit. But again, our zoning contemplates, these types of development. I want you to just watch the trees and where they go. This is Jill Kathleen Lane, another one off of Pleasant Street. This is another, I think this is 7 or 8 houses. You can start to see that site start to develop, from 1 or 2 houses with woods in the back to that subdivision. This is Wentworth Farm Road off of Hillside Street and Ford Ranch Road. This is another cluster subdivision, so requires a special permit, but is contemplated by our zoning. Our zoning, if not encourages people to do this, it allows them to. This is the Women's Club off of Reedsdale Road. This is now Mary Webster Lane. Again, one civic facility with woods in the back. Now a 4-house subdivision with that driveway. And then this one, Woodlot Drive, which is the Pulte development at Town Farm. So again, Town Farm. I forgot how many acres it was, but off of Unquity Road, all of the clearing, all of the grading, all of the removal of trees that needs to happen. Milton zoning today allows all of these. This is zoning, with the exception of the cluster, which was developed a couple decades ago. Our subdivision regulations and our single-family house lot regulations allow you to knock down all these trees and regrade all of this land and put all of these single-family houses where there are no amenities, where there is no transit, where the only thing that you can do to get out of your house is get in your car and drive somewhere. So when we talk about not just climate change impacts in terms of greenhouse gas emissions or loss of tree cover or loss of pervious surface, but just traffic congestion. What MBTA community zoning is trying to do is put new people that are going to live in Milton, and they're going to live in Milton. The demand to live in Milton is off the charts. And the demand to build in Milton is off the charts. People want to spend their money developing in Milton. You see it with the 40B projects. You see it with the subdivisions that we've got. Our zoning doesn't allow them to do anything except for this. And so I can't guarantee you that we're going to pass MBTA's community zoning and we're going to stop seeing people chop down trees to put in subdivisions. But to the extent that there is another option for development money to spend and to try to sort of make an investment in Milton in a place where existing infrastructure already exists, existing impervious surface already exists, and you're not exacerbating the impacts of development. MBTA Communities gives that option. So the next steps, this slide is usually bigger, but we're getting to the end. So the planning board held a public hearing on this proposed zoning on October 26th. That public hearing has been closed, but the planning board will be continuing to deliberate on this in order to make a recommendation to town meeting. And then special town meeting is scheduled for December 4th, 2023, where we'll be considering MBTA community zoning. The select board is meeting tomorrow morning to approve the warrant. Warrant should be going to print, I think, next week, and should be showing up. I don't know if it still goes to your mailbox, but it'll be available. It'll be available soon. So that's all I've got for now. We answered a couple questions before, but I think if people have questions or comments, if you want to kind of just make your way to the front and speak into the microphone, you can make yourself welcome to do that. I can hear you. Maybe can you pick that up off the stand? This is not a podium. It's like a little game board. I don't know what it is, but
Hello?
Yep.
Hello? I hear what you said about the fact that, we don't want to cut down more trees and all, but there's really nothing that's going to change that in this regulation. I mean, I kind of heard that as an argument for why we're proposing the development in the areas this Communities Act, in the areas that we're proposing, but none of that development on those other parts of town is going to change.
You're not wrong. And like I said, I can't guarantee that that'll stop, but I think to the extent that, there is, like I said, there's people that want to develop in the town of Milton, and they have no, and if a large lot owner wants to subdivide their lot and build houses, they can do that. I don't see those regulations being changed anytime soon. But to the extent that, for instance, the 40B developments, these are not property owners that are looking to make a jillion bucks on a 40B development. These are real developers that are coming into town. They want to spend their money in Milton. They know they can make a lot of money in Milton, and they're going to use whatever means they can to do it. So this is a situation where you've got big developers that want to build in Milton that have no other option except to do a 40B project. And until we get out from under 40B, the best that we can do is divert that attention to, frankly, an option that is easier than 40B, which is a by right, process. 40B, we kind of have to approve them, but we can put those guys through the ringer. And no one wants to do a 40B if they can get away with it. And so I think to the extent that, there's a lot of kind of real estate money that wants to be spent in Milton, we'd like people to spend it in places where, frankly, development is more appropriate than, building an apartment building in the middle of the woods. I think, some of the things that I showed you are kind of less about MBTA communities and more about, there's been an expression of, we're very concerned about, tree cover. We're very concerned about impervious surface. But, our zoning today is imperiling all sorts of different parcels in town that we consider to be, really important and really lovely kind of, character defining parcels. But your point is very well taken. I definitely understand. And like I said, I can't guarantee that, a certain outcome is going to happen. But I think when you provide an outlet for multifamily development that is in more appropriate locations, you start to see less of the stuff that's in less appropriate locations.
But also, too, what that does is, and part of your conversation was about, and to me, it's a flaw in this program because we can propose sites that nobody will really build on because the houses, the buildings there are only 10 years old or less. And what that also does, though, is it also puts a lot more pressure on the other parts that have been approved by this Communities Act, because that's where they're going to go because they can't build there. And one of those is East Milton Square, where I live. And it's just, it sounded like we were trying to make a trade-off there. One of the, in other sections of town, we were making trade-offs. We were offering land that wouldn't be built because the houses were too new. In East Milton, we were offering that piece of land on the future promise of some planning board changes that would require plan review, right? But there's really, again, that's risky. There's really no, this requires plan review, that requires plan review. You know, we're not, doesn't seem to me like we're offering much there.
No, I mean, there is an element of risk there. I definitely understand that. But I think, you know, East Milton kind of stands apart in the sense that, you know, and this was kind of something that got kicked off with, you know, the Falcone project that became the 40B project, where, you know, people in that neighborhood at that point started to say, look, we're seeing development pressure and it's not stuff that we like. And we want to get stuff that we like. And how can we do that? And the way to do that is through changing your land use regulations. And so that kind of initiated a long process of planning in East Milton Square that kind of has led to, and it is, you know, it's unfortunate that MBTA commutes came along in a sense because it kind of took a little bit of the wind out of the sails of that process and kind of, you know, put us in a position where, you know, we sort of, if you don't include East Milton in the MBTA community zone, then we need to find an entirely other part of town that we hadn't been considering to now put more multifamily housing on. And so what the treatment of East Milton does is kind of, you know, doubles up on, you know, we're getting credit for two things, the thing that we want to do and the thing that we don't want to do. So there was a question in the crowd if that was equitable. Do you mind coming up next so that we can talk that way? So, you know, I definitely get it, but I think, you know, the East Milton process has been kind of long running in terms of our planning there. I think, you know, there's an understanding that there's an interest in developing in East Milton, and we want to be able to control that development. And so that's where that other kind of planning board zoning process comes in, where, you know, we want to create the conditions where people will want to use that zoning. And that's the zoning that gives us more control than the MBTA community stuff.
And if this does, you know, seems like, to me anyway, it seems like it's inevitable. But if this does happen, and maybe someday people will not use their cars, but right now everybody is using their cars, we in East Milton need help with traffic. It's a nightmare. And if this development goes through, it's going to get worse. And so I guess what I'm asking for is if this does go through, how do we get some help with traffic? Because it's crazy.
Yeah, I know, and I hear that. I get it 100%. And I think that, you know, East Milton is at, you know, a literal crossroads. It's how you get in here from Quincy. It's how you get onto the highway. It's how you get off the highway. And so, you know, there's always been traffic in East Milton. There's always going to be traffic in East Milton. I think what we are trying to do with either of these zoning processes is sort of create conditions where there are more people that can live in East Milton and use the amenities in East Milton so that they're not driving in from some other part of town. But there's always going to be people that are going to be driving through East Milton. And so I think there are non-land use policy kind of things that need to happen, you know, in terms of, you know, people have mixed feelings about the deck project. You know, I think it improved things in some ways. I think in other ways, you know, people see it as a little bit more of a problem. But I think it's something that we're always, you know, keeping an eye on. We're always cognizant of. I said on the Traffic Commission, we talk about East Milton constantly. So I think, you know, I hear you. There's certain things that land use can control. There's other things that land use can't control. And I think we need to kind of deploy all of those resources to make sure that, you know, East Milton is a nice place that's not just, you know, cars passing through. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for doing these meetings and all your work. Yeah, I'm just curious. I mean, basically, 90% of Milton is unaffected by this. So, getting back to the question of equity, you know, East Milton is bearing the brunt of this. Bless you, along with Elliott Street, of course, and down by Mattapan Station. But I don't understand, and my question is, you know, what about the center of town? I mean, we should all have to take a little medicine here. we all understand this is a state plan, but should 90% of the town this doesn't affect them? And right out here, Reedsdale Road, the bus runs every 12 to 15 minutes all day long and all evening. So, I mean, this right around the library here, all sorts of amenities, and in contrast to, the folks on Cortlandt Circle, the existing traffic there, this is going to choke Granite Ave, and I think it's unneighborly to force 10% of the town to bear the burden. So what exactly were the criteria for these sub-districts? Because obviously they were discretionary.
No, so I think it's a very fair point, and I think it's something that we talked about, both at the planning board, we've talked about it at the select board, we've talked about it in these meetings, and it's a very fair point, and it's something that previous kind of iterations of what we've been doing have kind of attempted to kind of spread that burden. So I'm going to talk in two different kind of ways to kind of address this question. One of them is kind of internal to the MBTA community's process itself. So there are a couple requirements that kind of are unavoidable. We have to put 50% of our area in the transit area. That means 50% of the physical geography and 50% of the units. And as you can see from this sort of townwide map, definitionally that area is a relatively small part of town. Now we have the flexibility to put 50% of the rest of that district outside of the transit area. So we're not hitting 50%. We've got the Granite Ave South district you can see is outside, and East Milton is outside. We had looked at a couple other sub-districts that were outside of the transit area, and for a lot of reasons wound up not going with those. And I'll give you a couple examples. In the spirit of kind of taking advantage of, and one other thing that I'll have to mention is that any sub-district that we create has to be at least 5 acres, right? And so you could draw a 5-acre line around any part of town. It would be arbitrary. So you have to start to try to apply when we talk about kind of fairness and equity, I don't know how I can explain, we're just going to do, Ridgewood Road for some reason. Why do that one and not this part of Brush Hill Road? You've got to apply other criteria to sort of why you're making these decisions or why you're not making these decisions. So we had looked at the Fuller Village sites, for instance. So down on Brush Hill Road and Blue Hill Ave. So the criteria that we kind of apply there is existing multifamily, all right? So there's already a couple hundred units at Fuller Village. If we, do kind of what we're trying to do on the 88 Wharf site or the Hendry site, can we take advantage of that existing multifamily density so that, maybe Fuller Village probably won't redevelop anytime soon, but even if they do, it's not a huge increase in the amount of units. And the problem on that site is, even though it's a couple hundred units, it's also 60 plus acres. And so in order to have a number of units and a level of overall density that doesn't drag down the overall density of the entire zoning district, because remember, we have to get to 15 units per acre. And so we're at like 3 or 4 units per acre already down at Fuller Village. And so in order to get to a level where, you're at 10, 12, even 15, because you frankly need to be at 15, we were looking at something between like 800 and 1,300 units on those 2 sites. And that's a situation where, I know the folks at Fuller Village, maybe they wouldn't, but I mean, if you have the opportunity to go from 300 units to 1,300 units, that's a much more enticing proposition than going from 300 to 400. And so there's a real possibility if we do what we need to do in order to kind of have the overall conditions in the district down at Fuller Village, there's a serious likelihood of redevelopment there. And now you've got 1,300 units on the narrow portion of Brush Hill Road that, I think we sort of thought this is way too much. And so that kind of removed that as a possibility because you just couldn't make it work with the other sub-districts. similar to
Who decided that? The consultants or you?
I mean, we had a conversation at the planning board around this. The planning board has not kind of given the thumbs up or thumbs down to this zoning, but I think everything that has led to this point has involved planning board feedback and kind of our consultants' work responding to planning board feedback. So, but even if that wasn't the case, and it was a select board decision, informed by my advice, I just don't think that is a part of town that can handle 1,300 units. And so, you need to sort of look at what the existing infrastructure is and kind of look at the and again, we're talking about a place that, that many units, no amenities, no transit. There are other places that we looked. We looked at the, A. Thomas and Sons landscaping property, big commercial property on Randolph Ave. Wasn't going to be kind of affecting existing on-site housing, although there is a neighborhood over there. Similar situation where in order to get the number of units on that large of a site, it was way too much. And Randolph Ave, and this is kind of moving into kind of the second kind of criteria that we think about is outside of MBTA communities. When we talk about equity, when we talk about where is development happening in this town, we're looking at MBTA communities, but we're also looking at a 40B at 582 Blue Hill Ave, a 40B at the Ice House on Blue Hills Parkway, two 40Bs on Randolph Ave at 711 and 728, a 40B at 648 Canton Ave, new units at Winter Valley, right in that neighborhood, the memory care clinic at 111 Highland, again the same area, a new school on Blue Hills Parkway. So when we look at these sub-districts, we're working within the parameters of how do we get sub-districts that kind of balance and match up, and also what else is going on in town so that it's not on this map, but there's a lot of development pressure in a lot of different neighborhoods. So, I definitely understand what you're saying. I think we've tried to kind of figure out the best way to modulate and kind of extend the potential timeline for development in each of these districts. But we're also looking at what is the town-wide context and what else is going on in town so that, again, it's not MBTA communities, but it's a 40B or it's a school project or it's another special permit project. So it's a well-taken point, and that's kind of how we put our thought process behind it.
Last question. Was Yulin Rink considered?
Yulin Rink, again, it's a state property, and that's not a property that has been up for disposition or is part of a housing production plan. So we would not be able to zone it and get credit for it. All
right, thank you.
Yep.
Hi. Also, I want to thank you for all the time and effort you've put into this. And these are more statements than they are questions, I guess. But you're saying way too much because of the growth that this would require in these areas and how much expansion in housing. But from someone who lives in East Milton Square and has lived here for over 12 years now, we've hit way too much a while ago. The change in the last just few years and traffic patterns and the expansion projects we already spoke about the 40B and the apartment buildings that are going up on Granite. And if anyone came near East Milton Square last night on Halloween, which is kind of our sacred holiday, the amount of young children and young families that have come in to the area because, like you said, people want to live somewhere that they can walk to their surroundings. And yes, we offer that, but we talked mixed use, and I somewhat understood what you were talking about, but I think that's a piece of this that, we're already at way too much, and as Bob had said, I think some of the town, if this is going to go through, needs to share in some of the brunt of it, but also mixed use needs to be a part of this, because if we want it, it's great that we're creating zoning, but if we want it the end result to be that we're truly adding to the commutability to work and less cars, and we want the end result to be helping with the greenhouse effect, then we should be creating communities that people want to live in so that they can walk to things, and that is more mixed use and more commercial real estate. So I know you're working on all of this, and this is not an easy task, and I respect all the work that you and your peers have been doing. But from someone who lives in an area of town that I can't even get people to carpool with me because they can't get through the square at any point of day. And I know we expect traffic when we moved there, we understood that. But all the extra efforts that have gone through, whether it's the deck project or recent Granite Ave cutting down to less lanes, has just added that I can't even back out of my driveway in the morning, and I have 2 young children that I have to get to places. So I just ask if there's a way to relook at this. Like, for me right now, it is inequitable, and I just don't know how it's sustainable for the people who live in East Milton.
Thank you. Those are well taken points. I think one thing, and again, it's Milton is between the South Shore and the city of Boston, and so I think we're in a position where we need to kind of try to mitigate the effects. There's no getting rid of the traffic, and I think one thing to kind of keep in mind, and these are kind of huge, broad, statewide, nationwide issues. A lot of the traffic that you see coming through East Milton Square is, again, because of the location in town, definitionally people from elsewhere, from Quincy and south, and they're on the expressway, they're trying to get to the expressway. One of the reasons why you've seen such an explosion in traffic in the past 5, 10, 15, 20, however, whatever timeline you want to talk about, is related to the problem that a bill like MBTA Communities is trying to solve. Because people can't afford to live in Boston and Cambridge. And so they can't really afford to live in Milton either. So, if you can't afford to live in Jamaica Plain, you move to Dorchester. If you can't afford Dorchester, you have to skip Milton. Maybe you can make it to Quincy, but more than likely you're in Randolph, Stoughton, Avon, and further south. And so, these people are still commuting into city of Boston. And so, Milton's MBTA Communities efforts is not going to solve that problem, but what the state is trying to solve for the region is there is not enough housing in places where people can use the T and not have to drive their car. And towns have not taken it upon themselves to build that housing, and now we've got to make them do it.
And I understand that was my point in saying, like, if we're zoning areas that we don't think are actually going to get built, how are we contributing to fixing that? That's all I...
Hi, good evening, Tim, residents, board members. My name's Mark Christel. I live on Waldo Road. I've spoken at many of these meetings, both at the planning board and at other community forums. I know there are many challenges out here. I hate to see that we pit neighborhoods against each other. I live off the L8th Street corridor. And I know traffic and overdevelopment is a big concern, and we heard that obviously last Thursday from Granite Ave residents, and I've thought of that before and for my own neighborhood. And I think that we all can probably agree that we do want to control and limit development to the best of our ability. There are laws and there are regulations, et cetera. And I know that there's a classification issue and there's a compliance issue. And I have spoken on numerous occasions about my concern about the classification of the Mattapan trolley. I don't know how many people here actually ride it with some frequency. My guess is very few do, but it's good to see people do utilize the service. I know most people don't. But in looking at that Mattapan trolley, I really do not think it's rapid transit. I'd like just to walk through a few reasons why I feel strongly about it, because this is affecting the entire town. And if we can get that reclassified, it would be to everybody's benefit. We better be able to control the development process that's confronting us, and we could do it to attend to what the legal commitments are for us as well. I'm going to offer 3 compelling reasons why that's the case, both in terms of its operational function, the past historical records like I'd like to hit upon, as well as the future plans for the trolley that confirm, I believe, with consistency, support that the trolley never was nor is rapid transit. The operational inferiority of a small, antiquated single vessel with limited carrying capacity, there are only 38 seats on each trolley, serves only as a feeder to Ashmont. Ashmont is the terminus, which sits in Dorchester. We sit far beyond that. Additionally, the trolley has no ability to provide direct transport to downtown. That's a critical deficit. When you look at the comparisons to other rapid transit lines, they all get you to downtown and you wait at your local station, and then you take the train downtown to where your destination is. So it's just those 2 variables that you have to think about. For us, as Milton residents utilizing the Mattapan trolley, you wait at your local stop, you take the trip to Ashmont, but you're required to transfer. Everybody has to transfer. So right there are three variables. At that point, you have to transfer to the rapid transit train for which you have to wait, and the trains oftentimes have to be sequenced. So in order for that to occur, to get to downtown Boston, there are 4 additional steps. That takes time to do that, and you're not always assured of a seat as well when you make that transfer. You lose your priority the second you disembark from the trolley. That's a big difference. Clearly, the Mattapan trolley is distinctly dissimilar from rapid transit, and the carrying capacity of the rapid transit train that you get on with 65 seats, the Red Line rapid transit train that has 6 contiguous vehicles, equates to about 390 seats. That's a big difference between the Mattapan trolley, and that's what riders of the Braintree line, have to deal with. So to support 25% housing development in Milton, I think based upon that vehicle is, and it's erroneous. It's an erroneous assumption upon which to base this housing agenda. The 2 other points that I just want to bring up was back in the late 60s, there was a proposal to convert the Mattapan trolley to rapid transit. It would have drastically altered service operations and the physical landscape. That was abandoned by the MBTA back in 1969, but had it gone through, we would have lost 3 of our 4 stops along the line. Capon Street, Valley Road, Central Ave would have been gone. There would have only been 1 stop at Milton, and if that were the case, most of the development would be along Milton Station corridor and around Mattapan as well, too, if we were rapid transit. We're using a rapid transit formula, and we don't have a rapid transit system. That's complicating the process, I believe, for the town. And the third point was that the proposed $66 million Mattapan transformation project will renovate, but it will not incorporate the trolley as part of rapid transit going forward. So with consistency, I feel that we do not have rapid transit service, and we shouldn't be categorized as a rapid transit community. I know that we're one of 12 communities that are categorized as such, but if I'm not mistaken, Tim, maybe you could weigh in on this. I thought I had read once that the city of Melrose had been categorized as rapid transit, and they were reclassified at some point to a lesser status. So I don't say that reclassification is not a possibility. If it's happened for Melrose and we have a good point, I think we should pursue it. I think it would be beneficial for all residents. And that's about it. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. To your one question, I don't have any knowledge about Melrose, but we can look into that. It would have been sort of a change from the first draft of the guidelines to the final draft of the guidelines, but we'll look into that and see if we can get an answer on that one. Thank you.
Am I coming through okay here? A couple of points. The first is more of a comment on the design guidelines, and the second is a general comment about noncompliance, which hasn't been discussed much tonight. So if you drive through Milton today, you'll see a lot of architectural continuity in the designs of the homes. They're all or mostly colonial or Victorian homes, and 1 or 2 stories. And that's also true with the Elliott Street corridor. It also is single-family Victorian or colonial with A-frame roof styles. I've been looking at the zoning regulations, and for the Elliott Street corridor, it talks about 2.5-story limit, and it's either 30 or 35 foot height max. And I'm concerned about the introduction of design standards that aren't consistent with the rest of the town. For example, developers like to use mansard roof designs as a workaround to get extra elevation on their street, on their property that they're developing. It'd be a shame if all of the property that is currently being rezoned as multifamily on Elliott Street all turn into mansard roof designs. Now you're driving through one part of town and you're seeing one style of architectural design. You drive through another part of town, you're seeing something different. I guess a comment or a question, if it's not too late, maybe we can have an opportunity to include in the development standards, the design standards, some restrictions on the mansard roof design. As you can tell, I'm not a big fan of that. Anyway, switching gears a little bit, I want to talk a little bit about noncompliance. Milton really does have a choice here. The language that's being amended in the Milton zoning's bylaws to bring the town into compliance with the HLC guidelines is expected to be voted on by the town meeting on December 4th of this year. Once as of right multifamily districts are in place, neighbors have little recourse to mitigate or challenge the negative effects of the development near their homes. Mr. Christo touched on reclassification, and I think that's an important topic, but also we need to consider noncompliance as an option. It's important that town meeting members and the general public understand the ramifications of complying with the current guidelines and the effect implementation will have on our neighborhoods. The penalty for noncompliance is a potential loss of grant funding, which has been approximately $100,000 per year over the past 10 years. The 2024 budgeted expenditure for the town of Milton is $147 million. The average annual income from grant money loss over the past 10 years of $100,000 would represent a 0.07% budget impact. That's my bit on noncompliance. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. To your first point about design guidelines, there are development standards in the zoning right now. The zoning also reserves the right for the planning board to adopt a sort of separate design guideline document. So again, if and when the zoning is complete, that's something that the planning board can choose to avail themselves of to, it's with by right zoning, it's a little bit tougher. If anyone kind of followed our Milton Village design guidelines process, it's a special permit. Planning board has a lot of discretion to say, you've got to do this, you can't do that. With the by right scheme, you've got to kind of set really objective prescriptive standards. But that's something that we can we've reserved the right to do that, at a future time through the zoning. So that's definitely a conversation that we can have in the future.
Hi, my name is Andy Handley. I grew up in New York City. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Okay. I grew up in New York City. I'm very familiar with rapid transit systems. I'm a big fan of them. I've been here for 50 years in the Boston area, and I've seen the MBTA fail the entire metropolitan community. And the reason why our roads are clogged is because our MBTA system in general is not working properly. My sister hasn't been here in a dozen years. She visited me from Europe 3 weeks ago. I dropped her off at Milton Village. I said, make your way into town, enjoy yourself. When she came home that evening, she said, the trolley didn't come, a bus came and dropped her off at Kennedy Station. This has been going on for as long as I've lived, for 30 years in this town. The first 10 years I used a trolley, wasn't working too badly, okay? And the red line wasn't working too badly. And then I got away from using the trolley. They were going to discontinue the trolley about a dozen years ago. Now we have steps in Milton Village that the MBTA does not even want to repair. And that's a zoning, is that a zoning area that we're discussing here?
T to court on that one, and we lost. So the T, generally is trying to get out of the business of stairs. So the redesigned Milton Station is going to have, they're trying to build a ramp system. But I think they found that stairs are a liability.
So a ramp system, what is that?
So rather than steps down from Adams Street, a ramp down from Adams Street.
A
to get to the
ramp
station.
down from Adams Street. How does that work? Are wheelchairs going down or?
Yeah, or people walking.
Oh, wow. Wow, rapid transit. So again, you're comparing the Green Line where you can get on in Newtonville and get into downtown Boston on one trip, as somebody mentioned here. But here, you're lucky if you can get to downtown in an hour with this system. And you wonder why the roads are all clogged. Come on, Tim. This is a scam. And I encourage everybody who's watching this now, who's a town meeting member, to really vote this down. Vote this down. It'll destroy this town. And it won't take cars off the road. I've seen more cars, more traffic traveling through this town in the last 25 years. And it's not going to get better. You're not going to save the world if you can't save your own town. I plant trees in my backyard. This is a green town. This is a beautiful town. The trolley is a farce.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Tim, for everything you're doing. And I guess I have some statements and then some questions. So when I've seen areas re-imaged, commercial manufacturing, industrial, and brown sites, they've always built infrastructure to support those re-imaged areas. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Assembly Row, they built a brand new Orange Line station. When we look at the South Boston Seaport and Chelsea, where they've been re-imaging all those kinds of areas, the Pioneer apartment building, the Vero apartments, they've built infrastructure. And so here we are with existing infrastructure that was designed to service the existing town's requirements. We're not talking about changing infrastructure. We're talking about just adding more density without any of those changes. The Greenbush line, also on the South Shore, they built that and with the idea of redeveloping or bringing transportation to those areas. But the Greenbush came and then things kind of happened down there. So it's just, it's odd to me. And there's something else that's been kind of bothering me. So we always talk about the law being blind, but from what I understand, the city of Boston's not required to comply with this law, yet some of the stations, specifically Cedar Grove, is affecting what has to happen here in the town of Milton. And you may not know the answer to this question, but I'm curious if the Dorchester, Cedar Grove area would comply with this MBTA zoning law that we're proposing for Milton, and if those areas already comply with it or not.
So thank you. And to answer your question, the MBTA Communities Law, Section 3A of Chapter 40A. 40A is the zoning act for 350 of the 351 cities and towns in the Commonwealth. 40A does not affect City of Boston. City of Boston has its own separate zoning enabling act. So if you want to require City of Boston to do something, you need to go ahead and change that zoning enabling act. That's a arcane, silly answer, but that's the reason why City of Boston is not required to comply with MBTA communities. If it was, there are dozens of zoning districts in the City of Boston that would comply without change. And the way that the law is written is that you need to have one zoning district of reasonable size, and then reasonable size, has geographic components and unit capacity components. But I think the sheer number of by right multifamily zoning districts in the City of Boston, it might not be Cedar Grove, but there's dozens of areas in the City of Boston that will comply. So it's been sort of a criticism that's been leveled, but Boston is for better or for worse a city that has been building housing at a rate beyond other cities and towns in the region, and has the zoning to sort of allow it. So to your question about Cedar Grove specifically, I don't think, I mean, that's predominantly a single and two family neighborhood, so I don't think that zoning would necessarily comply, but The way that the law is structured, it's about municipal boundaries. It's about town of Milton. It's not about, city of Boston because Cedar Grove happens to be there. We only are responsible for the developable area of that radius within the town of Milton. So,
Okay. And then I also know this particular law, unlike all other stuff that comes before town meeting, it's a 2/3 majority, but because of this regulation that was written in by the state because it's housing related, it's a majority vote, so 51%. I'm just curious, what happens if we don't hit the 51% at town meeting, and does it require a 2-year moratorium like other stuff in the town?
that's a good question. I don't have an answer for that. So we'll have to talk to the moderator and town council about what the implications of that are. I think that's going to have to be, just like a lot of articles where, if you see the wind is blowing in a certain direction, you may make a motion to refer it back for further study, kind of preserve your kind of ability to come back. But that's something that we'll need to talk about with the moderator.
And then there was something else I wanted to ask, but I can't remember what it is. So thank you.
Yep. So we're a little bit over time. So I see we've got one more person that wants to approach the mic, and that's going to unfortunately have to be it for the evening. 2 more people at the mic, and that's
Janet
it.
Hanley, and I'm a retired pediatric nurse practitioner. I worked for Atreus Health for 40 years, and we saw an awful lot of pediatric asthma in the Boston area. It's specifically higher in poorer communities, but it's very much higher along highways. So to think we're going to have kids in housing on Granite Avenue, and it just sounds horrifying to me. We definitely see a 10 to 15% increase in pediatric asthma and in adult asthma as well. So air quality is really important. It's the last place I'd put any kind of housing. Thank you.
I'd first like to say, I want to tell you how much I appreciate all the work you've done, and you should definitely be getting comp time for all this overtime. But anyway, I was wondering, could you put up the map that shows all the zones and then the half mile, the red line with the half mile? Okay, okay. So I know that the state, the select board did ask to have the category change, but you got a letter back from the state saying no, that it had to stay the way it is. But they also said there were 404 acres of developable land within the half mile. So, but you're only using 400 something?
So the sort of the red scalloped line and the sort of the black dashed line at the top, which is the northern border of the town, that's your 404 acres. So what you see that's not zoned in that 404 acres right now is, and again, this is kind of, how do you make the decision to put something in? How do you make the decision to take something out? You want to try to have some type of planning criteria so that it's not an arbitrary kind of capricious decision. So what's out of the district right now is the Milton Hill Historic District, right, which is a federal register national historic district. We kind of came to a decision relatively early on saying, we're going to have to, and I understand, we're zoning certain places, we're not zoning others, so how do you make that decision? It's a historic district. We didn't want to put development pressure on the sort of the character defining homes in that historic district. Understood, sir, but they're not within a sort of recognized federal historic district. And so I say you have to have a criteria, and on one side there's a clear answer, and on one side there's another clear answer. This is what I'm talking about. The other issue, and we did a test of the compliance model that sort of basically said, what would you need to do to zone this entire area? And from there we kind of whittled it down. because what happens if you zone this entire area is, remember that your multifamily number is 3 units at the lowest. So if we said, and it kind of goes in two different directions, if you were to zone all of these single-family house parcels for 3 units, we would be over the 2461 that is our minimum requirement. And what we heard very early on was we're not interested in doing more than we have to do for all sorts of municipal impact reasons. And so zoning that whole area, because there's a minimum requirement for the number of units on a parcel, you're now over your requirement. Now you're over your unit count, but you're way under on your overall density. The overall density of that whole area at 3 units per parcel is far below 15 units per acre. So the way that you increase that overall density is you go from 3 units on a parcel to 4 units, or 5 units, or 6 units, or 7 units, or however many you need to get up to that overall density. And so again, like I said, when you zone that entire area, you're already over on the unit capacity. And if you were to increase the number of units per parcel, now you're getting hundreds, thousands of units over your unit capacity. And so one of the other animating kind of fundamental principles that we had was, how do we draft zoning that does its best to limit the potential for teardowns? And the way that we do that is each individual parcel is allowed to do the lowest possible unit count as possible. And we set dimensional parameters so that the buildings could fit in the footprint of a single family house. So if you take some of these larger parcels where you've got big parcels and only do 3 units on them, the overall density of that parcel is way low. And if you increase the overall density of that parcel, now you're saying, well, why would you keep this single family house if you can put 10 units on a 20,000 square foot lot? And now we're seeing teardowns, and now we're seeing a dramatic change to the physical character of the neighborhood. So even though there is a lot of area available, it's all already developed. And we have a stronger likelihood of preserving Elliott Street than we have of preserving Adam Street or some of the other streets further down, because of the necessary increase in density to sort of hit that overall density metric. So that's kind of the answer to that question. The other way to make up for that is super dramatically increase the density at Mattapan Square and in Milton Village. Again, to a point of, tower-style buildings as opposed to the sort of mid-size kind of 6-story, 4-story buildings that we're talking about. So, that's the answer.
Okay, I've combed through a lot of documents on the town of Milton, and I came up with 2 places that I wondered if you had considered. 0 Blue Hill Ave is 6.85 acres of undeveloped, zoned residential A, highly desirable area. Was that 0?
Which where on Blue Hill Ave is that?
I don't know. It says 0.
We didn't talk about it at any sort of real length. That's one where it just happens to be a large parcel somewhere in town. And how do you pick that one as opposed to another 6-acre parcel somewhere else? Like I say, you're trying to apply planning criteria beyond just, here's a big parcel. That's the reason.
Okay.
Thank you. So thanks a lot. That was it for this evening. I appreciate everyone coming out. A lot of good questions, a lot of good comments. If you have any additional questions, comments, please feel free to reach out to me. That's what I'm there for. Again, Planning Board is continuing to deliberate on a recommendation to town meeting. Town meeting happens on December 4th. Thanks again for coming. Have a great night.